When I started out as a professor, I would teach large classes, 120, 140 people. And as a point of pride, by about the third or fourth week, I had memorized everyone's name and everyone's face so that when I called on them or when I talked to them in the hall, I knew who they were. And I actually had a fellow professor who made a rule that was, if this is way before you had electronic rosters with people's faces. If you brought him a 3x5 card with your photo and with the name on the back, and he could not recognize you by the end of the semester, you got an A in the class. And so he used that as his own spur to get to memorize people. Nowadays, if I have a graduate seminar with a dozen people in it, by the end of the semester, I'm still struggling with one of those names. And some of that is, I don't know what that is. Some of it I think is just aging. I'm not super old, but little things like that at the edges of your memory start to go away. I still know what my name is and my home address is most days, but things like the name of someone in my class whom I've seen once is going to escape me more likely. So things are changing for me, and I really need a solution to that. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but I want to be able to know these things, and it seems like at our level of technology, I should be able to do that. And so this is kind of a question of how we become better human beings. This goes all the way back to the issue that Plato had with writing in the first place, with all technology, but particularly with written technology. What he said was that, through Socrates, what he said was that, the problem with writing is that it ruins people's memories. I'm not sure that that's true. I'm not sure that either writing or reading or using the computer is to blame entirely for the way my memory works, but I think our memories are changing. When I was a kid, we all knew our own phone numbers and the phone numbers of our friends and our relatives. We had those memorized because we used them. Now they've disappeared. I have mastered my own phone number, which I'm very proud of. It took me about a year to not have to look at my phone to figure out what my phone number was, but I now have it down. I can't change numbers ever again. So we lose things a little bit because they're not as vital right in front of us. There's a big debate around this, whether the future of being educated is whether you can have facts on your brain and be able to come up with the date that something happened, or whether you need to be very good at searching and finding this information very quickly using a device and then thinking about it and analyzing it. Which of these defines knowledge in the 21st century? In the 20th century, knowing what the capital of Bolivia was far more important than it is right now. Because now it'll take me 20 seconds to find that out if I don't know it offhand. In each of these cases, the technologies are extensions of man. So when we talk about kind of this technology as an extension, what comes to mind is exoskeletons and Iron Man. And there is something to that, right? This idea of building things that are attachments to our bodies. Dr. Inspector, I came up with eventually, brain, Inspector Gadget, this idea of having like pieces added onto our body. But really the question is much more interesting when it comes to brain augmentation. How do these work with the way we think and the way we live in our world? So when we talk about extensions, what McLuhan called extensions of man, we're largely talking about the combination of physical and intellectual extension and social extension. How does this connect us to the worlds around us? How does it let us think about it? And then how does it let us interact with other people around us?
This fragmentation had begun much earlier with after the hunter and the food gatherers with Neolithic man. I suppose in an extreme way one might say that Gutenberg was the last phase of the Neolithic Revolution. Gutenberg plus the Industrial Revolution that followed was a pushing of specialism that came in with the Neolithic man, the Agrarian Revolution, a pushing of specialism all the way. And then suddenly We encounter the electric or electromagnetism, which seems to have a totally different principle, is, for some people feel, an extension of our nervous system, not an extension of merely of our bodies. If the wheel is an extension of feet and tools of hands, back, arms, the electromagnetism seems to be, in its technological manifestations, an extension of our nerves and becomes mainly an information system.
So for me, the quintessential, and admittedly, I have I'm very finely focused on, especially recently, this question of wearable technology. But for me, the quintessential human technology is a wearable technology. When we talk about extensions of man in a very broad and ambiguous sense, that's one thing. But when we talk about it in a very specific sense, it seems like it's this sort of these things that make us into a cyborg, right? And we've always been cyborgs. The cybernetic organism is thought of as this combination of robot and human, but we've always included technology as part of who we are and part of what we are. Again, this can be this ambiguous, broad application that is without reading and writing, without the possibility of creating history, human society does not exist. And so this idea of language as a key technology makes us into a cyborg. But if that's too abstract for you, if the idea of language as a technology, which it absolutely is too abstract, then think of it instead in terms of eyeglasses. These are things that we've had eyeglasses now in one form or another for a very long time, and it is a worn technology, a technology that's on your body. Of course, if we want to go into that history, if you wanted to mark the point when we became human, it probably was when we started wearing clothing. That is, our first wearable technology was clothing, going back all the way before we were humans, in fact. I mean, Neanderthals wore clothes. So this kind of way of protecting us from the environment. Now, clothing does a whole bunch. Clothing is a really fashion, and clothing and textiles are really kind of important as a technology. I think they're ignored as a technology all the way up to the modern era. And so it wasn't just to protect us from the environment. That's probably why early man and pre-man wore this technology, wore this clothing, because you needed some form of protection from the climate, from animals, from other things. But generally speaking, that's just one of the tasks. Most of us wouldn't need to wear clothing today, given that we have environmental controls, right? There's not a particular good reason. We don't need the same level of protection as we did in the past. But we still wear clothes because they serve a whole bunch of other functions. We also carry tools, this also goes all the way back to the Neanderthals, that affect the environment around us. Now, we've always had tools, for Heidegger and others, the quintessential tool is either the home or the hammer. So we've always had these things that either protected us or affected the environment, but we've always also had technologies that we carried with us. And so going back to the Neanderthal, the obvious one here is things like weapons that we've carried with us, these weapons so that we could hunt, right? So sidearms of one form or another, knives, spears, and eventually guns, are this kind of way of affecting the environment around us. But we may carry other things around with us, multi-tools. If we're someone whose job, whose social role and employment role is to fix things, then we probably carry around a set of tools that we always have with us to fix those things. It's kind of either for diagnostics or for actually altering things. So I don't know a lot of people that walk around with a pocket welding set or something like that, but I know a lot of people who walk around with a set of screwdrivers or with a multi-tool of some sort, because they want to be able to change machinery around them or be able to affect things more easily when their hands just won't do it. One of the ways we do this is one of the kinds of tools that we carry or that we extend our bodies with are things that affect the environment, that change things around us. We also have things that sense the environment. As I said, eyeglasses and ear horns, and kind of the modern equivalent of both, hearing aids, things like that. Basically, in some cases, for now, it's often fix what may be seen as deficient hearing or deficient vision. But I think that people are moving from using it for that to augmentation. You could say that, for example, sunglasses are not strictly to fix a vision problem. They're to enhance your vision in heavy sun. Some people wear blue blocking glasses when working with the computer to be able to kind of interact with that space more easily on their eyes. so there are a range of extensions. I mean, at the extreme end of this is kind of things like people that are wearing IR goggles or UV goggles, ways of extending the visual light that normally humans can't see, and making that part of their visual experience of the space around them. Certainly, there are things like compasses that will sense where magnetic north is, and now GPS devices which will sense where you are according to the satellites spinning around our Earth. There are things. This goes on much further. I mean, we can talk in a second about ways of sensing things that you can't see through some playing around with implantable devices. So a whole range of technologies that allow you to kind of sense the world. There are a range of technologies that allow you to calculate, the obvious being a calculator or a soroban, a portable, what do we call this? Bead counter of some sort. And then memory agents. So, memory agents are essentially, one of the memory agents is kind of pen and paper, right? And people did carry, I pulled this out because I wasn't carrying it at the moment, but as many academics like everyday carry in my pocket a small notebook and a pen. This is, kind of, not everybody does this, but a lot of people do. So this idea of being able to record things, and that idea of a pen, it didn't used to be. The nice thing about this pen is it's a space pen, so it writes up and down. It's a pressurized cartridge, so it's pretty easy. That was a lot harder with quill and ink, but as soon as people started to use charcoal and could record things, they often would travel with those things and record them as kind of a way of recording things around them. So a form of distributed memory. Many of you may be familiar with Kipu, the way that the Incans recorded. Well, we think now they used it for recording, mostly for tax records. So for figuring out who had paid what, as an accounting process. But they would wear that as a way of doing it, and versions of Kipu of knot-based systems of memory go back, or notches or knots go kind of across the world, right? So you find them in Scandinavia, you find them in Hawaii. So this idea of recording your environment on something you wear is one way of doing it. I suppose you could say that tattoos might serve that function, although they are mostly used as a way of communicating. But you might say that they also could serve a memorial function of one way or another. And people would carry around books. There are miniature, especially religious texts, but so people might carry around a Bible in a very small form so that they could have it at hand at all times. And this is not just for Christianity; kind of across the board, people would carry various kinds of reminders of sutras or of other ways of remembering religious texts. And so that might be useful. I mean, not just religious texts. The reporters during the early days of journalism would carry around a little tiny code book that they could use to encrypt their messages when they sent telegrams so that nobody would scoop their message, right? Others did too. They had kind of code books that they would carry around with them, and these were also very small because they needed to fit in a pocket and be able to go wherever you did, because as soon as you needed to send a telegram, you'd have to sit down and encipher it using this code book. And maps. You have a compass to sense where you are, but that doesn't do you any good if you don't have a map. So people might carry around a small map. The classic example of the map in a handkerchief and things like that, which they still sell for the New York subway system. You can buy a map of the New York subway system on a handkerchief. So this idea of a map system being recorded, because you're not going to memorize the map immediately. So when you're in an area you don't entirely know or don't know very well, then having a memory system in the form of a transportable map is important. Or the lining of this is the lining of bomber jackets, or sometimes silk maps that have been sewn into the lining, that sort of thing. So we have this kind of whole range of ways in which these things are used. I would say, so I said that the code book was a memory device. It gets a little fuzzy here, but I would say the very most important technology is wearable technology that is for communicating. This gets a little ambiguous because many of the things I've already talked about are actually communications technology. I would say that a sidearm, especially in a modern society, and in non-modern, pre-modern society, a sidearm was much more about communicating power than it was about exercising death upon others, right? This is why the samurai were allowed to carry 2 swords, but also this is why people who are carrying sidearms have authority. It's not necessarily because you think that they are going to shoot you, although that certainly is part of it. It is because they have been, depending on where you are, in Arizona this doesn't really hold, but in many places if you see someone carrying a sidearm, it means they have been given that responsibility by someone in authority. So more than a badge, that sidearm may say something about the amount of power they have. I mean, mall cops might have a badge, but theoretically, at least, you're taken somewhat more seriously if you're issued a sidearm. So it's a way of communicating power much more than actually exercising that power. Clothing is absolutely needed for communication. It tells a story about who you are to those around you. It defines whether you fit. If it's a uniform, that's much more clear, right? Obviously it says I belong here because I'm wearing a uniform, but uniforms can be much more ambiguous, and there's ways of saying I belong here because I'm wearing the informal uniform of whatever your subgroup is, right? So it's a way of communicating in-group, out-group. It's a way of communicating social status. So clothing has a very heavy communicative role. So each of these, even eyeglasses and things like that, although they're sensing instruments, they also say something about the person who's wearing them. So they are a communicative a device. So all of these to a greater or lesser extent probably have a communication role. And so I think looking at wearable technologies as a communication technology is probably fairly useful. All of these things, that whole list of stuff I've given you, there is, if you look on Pinterest or on Instagram for EDC, for everyday carry, you'll see that people carry a whole panoply of things. This could be in a purse or in a pocket, right? Things that you have on you all the time. But a lot of those, certainly not all of those, but a lot of those, I don't have my phone to wag in front of you. Well, I do, I can do that. I've gone down to this convergence device, right? So this is the way I can take down, even though I still keep a notebook because there's reasons that make that easier sometimes. This allows me to converge a lot of those technologies together. I don't need a CB radio, I don't need a walkie-talkie, I should say, because it's a wearable device. I don't need a bullhorn. I don't need, I don't need an encoding device. I don't need a lot of these things. I don't need a calculator because a lot of them kind of converge on the modern mobile device. So we do have this convergence towards this. I think the next level of convergence is towards devices that you don't actually have to hold. And so, one of those is a smartwatch of one form or another that is kind of an extension of the phone. But a lot of these are moving towards subdermal devices, things that end up inserted under your skin in one way or another. And a lot of that right now is hacking because, there's things like glucose monitors, which people often require. It's not a matter of augmentation, but again, making up for a deficiency of one form or another. So I've got some neighbors nearby who have 2 little kids who are type 1 diabetics, and they have they wear a subdermal glucose monitor, and so they can, no matter where their parents are, they go to school, they're grade schoolers, but wherever their parents are, they can see what their kids' glucose levels are. And if it dips too low, they can call the school nurse and say, hey, can you bring a juice to whoever? They have that level of control because they can sense their kids' blood glucose levels. I know others who are playing with these technologies because they're expensive, but playing with them who are doing it for athletic reasons, who are training as athletes and want to measure blood glucose. And other folks who are kind of playing with those subdermal technologies. Eventually, I suspect that we will all be wearing subdermal technologies that measure things like blood chemistry. But on the hacker side, there's people who are playing with these other pieces. And so these include things like folks who have implanted neodymium magnets in their fingertips. And some of it's just because you can then stick things on your fingertips and say, hey, look, I can stick to things, which isn't very interesting. But soon enough, when people started doing this, they realized that if they put them in the fingertips where there's kind of a density of neurons, that they could actually sense things like electrical fields around them. People who live in big cities could sense when they were going over electrical generators or over large magnets, or could sense electrical flows in wires and things like that through their fingertips, because the fingertips are so sensitive, and because the battery is or the magnet is so sensitive. They have basically they have a spidey sense, right? They have a new way of sensing the world around them. A bunch of people have inserted RFIDs usually in their hands. These are little chips that can communicate wirelessly, and this has been going on now for 15 plus years, I guess. It's more than 10 years ago that California made it illegal for employers to require you to get chipped. And most doctors, it gets on the edge there, right? Most doctors and body mod people won't do this, but I was at a party where there was a vet who brought his little needle that shot RFIDs into people, and I was in the queue to do it, but they just ran out of time or lost nerve or some combination of those both. But basically, you would kind of shoot usually in here or in here a little RFID, and that way when you go to open a door, it knows that it's you. Or if you have a lock on your computer or your phone, as long as you have your hand with you, you can get into that lock. And so it's this idea of having a permanent ID that can radio contact things in your very near neighborhood. So I think we are moving past that barrier. I think there is still an ick factor anytime you pierce the skin. Nobody has a problem with a pacemaker because you either have it or you die, right? So for medical reasons, or even an implanted, a joint replacement or something like that, that's just, it's weird, but it's kind of necessary. In certain places, it's funny because I've lived in a bunch of different cities, and compared to Seattle, you just don't see very many piercings and other kinds of body modifications here. But in some places, I think there's subcultures where body modification is much more common. Things like tattoos are subdermal technologies, communication technologies, maybe one of the oldest subdermal technologies, because you have to pierce the skin to do coloration. And so it's not like it's brand new, but there are still people who are kind of grossed out by needles for tattoos as well. I think that we start to get under the skin, literally, with our technologies moving pretty quickly here. I think people are going to get sick of wearing a watch to do this stuff. And when it gets, I don't want this implanted in my wrist, but when it gets to be paper thin, maybe. It's not entirely beyond the possibility of implanting these devices, so I don't have to worry about them as much. The next big step is brain-machine interfaces, and those probably will have to be subdermal. The earliest of these actually required you to drill a hole in the skull because the skull turns out to be a pretty good insulator for electrical signals, and so to get a really good view of what the brain was doing, you really had to put a sensor on the surface of the brain. And I think we've actually made some good progress in moving away from that and being able to make sense of what's coming through the skull. But I think we'll move that's not moving as quickly, but it's moving more quickly than I expected, I should say. So I think we're going to see more and more crossing over towards direct brain interfaces with various devices, and that could go pretty far, where you could start to make sense of what people are thinking at any given time. So I mentioned this kind of catalog of wearable technologies just so you have a feeling for what I mean when I say wearable technologies, and why I think they're the most important technologies for us. Because I think when we change our wearable technologies, we change as humans. I think we're largely defined by what we wear. And so I think that piece is really important to watch, especially over the next 10 years, but also much further than that, because I think someone that came to us from 50 years ago would recognize some of our wearable devices. Some people still wear eyeglasses, for example. I have a new pair coming because although I got LASIK about 11 years ago, I'm starting to lose my distance vision in one eye. So I'm going to be wearing glasses, and someone coming from the 1910s would certainly recognize what glasses are, even if they wouldn't understand what Google Glass was, right? They have no idea what the deal with the cell phones are or why people are looking at them constantly. That would be something that would require some explanation. And I suspect that the wearable technologies people will have in the next 15 years will look completely foreign to us as of today. So I think that's the rate of change in these technologies is incredibly fast. And as a result, the rate of change in what we are as human beings is changing. And as I said, as these technologies change, we change as human beings. Part of that is because our experience of the world and the record of the world is changing. So, we look back and we really have to do, if we want to know how Marcus Aurelius lived, or if we want to know how ancient Egyptians lived, even if we want to know how people lived, 50 years ago, it's kind of hard to piece those things together. Some people kept records of their correspondence. This is kind of an old-fashioned thing to do. If you thought you were going to be an important person in the future, you might carbon copy or make copies of your correspondence before it went out. Now everybody does. Your emails are recorded. Many people archive them, but even if you don't, there's a good chance Google is doing it for you. So that part is already recorded, but so is. If you're wearing a phone, or if you're starting to record these things, so much more in minute detail can be recorded. I mean, my heart rate throughout the entire day is recorded, where I am, my location. And once you match this with some of the other tools we have, you can find out kind of where you are, who you were with, what you were planning to do, how productive you were at any given second, how you were feeling at any given second. You could kind of surmise. So all of this is being recorded on an ongoing basis. And because of the memory issue, sometimes I'm recording audio as well, so I don't forget something, so it can be transcribed and I can search it later. So this kind of memory of our everyday lives, both as augmentation to our personal memory, but also as augmentation to our social memory, is a pretty huge change. And for a while, people just said, well, we'll never be able to record all that stuff. But our recording technologies have improved such that it doesn't really make sense to throw stuff away in the same way, right? As the cost of large-scale memory gets lower and lower, we can pretty much permanently record everything. There's no reason to throw anything out. We'll just keep on accumulating it. The only difficulty then is searching through it, but we can leave that to future generations potentially, or to AI or to other things to kind of make sense of all this stuff, because we've got it all. It's kind of like people who have their heads frozen in the hopes that future technology will be able to make sense of whatever structures there are in their brain. Here we're recording all this stuff, and some of it we can get to pretty easily, but I suspect we'll be able to mine it in much more interesting ways in 50 years. And again, the kinds of things right now, the jump to heart rate monitors, I wore a Fitbit for a long time, which just did steps. And the thing I really wanted was this kind of continuous heart rate monitoring. And now most smartwatches can do that. And they're pushing into other areas in very interesting ways. I think that especially once you breach the sort of, once brain-machine interfaces or brain-computer interfaces become much more common, being able to measure emotions, being able to measure attention, things like that will be fairly easy. Eventually, your visual cortex is not an exact map. It's not like a bitwise map of the world, but there's no reason to think that, especially with learning systems, with machine learning, you couldn't interpret what people are seeing, because it does, while it's not a mere reflection, the visual cortex is in some ways a topographical mapping of what people are seeing. And so if you can measure that directly, or if you can wear contacts that measure the visual field, all of these things might vastly increase what we're recording on a day-to-day basis. For me, the processing is the piece, right? As I said, what I really want is facial recognition. I met one of my kids. We went to summer camp, and I met one of the parents' kids. I met one of the parents of one of my kids' friends, and they could see, because I was going like this, that I didn't remember who they were. And I said, "Nice to meet you." And they said, "Oh yeah, we had that very nice talk a year ago." And I didn't remember this at all. Like, sometimes I'll remember an inkling, like I really should remember who this is, but in this case, completely forgotten who this person was. And so it would be really nice if, when I looked at someone, I got a quick readout of what their name was, where I met them, why I know them, all that sort of thing. Would I feel weird about that? Not at all. Absolutely zero. If I could use the pieces of my brain that are remembering my kids' friends' parents' names and faces, and I could repurpose that to something else, I would do it in a heartbeat. So it's not just the recording, it's also the processing and sensing of the world that I think will improve very quickly. And in case it's not obvious, this means that these personal extensions become social extensions, right? Once I can do that, it means that my relationships with people will change. It means that these ties might be different. It means that when I'm in a room with someone, I will know everyone in there and how I'm related to them, and maybe even friends of a friend who they're related to. I might know something about them. I might, be able to access their social record in some way, kind of automatically. And that changes the way we interact with one another. And because of that, wearable technologies have always been technologies of power, of status, of control. That's always been the case, that people have used these technologies in order to both affirm and reinforce their social positions. And so as a result, worn and wearable technologies are pretty essential political technologies. They're deeply enmeshed in questions of power. And so I think as these technologies are changing, those who adopt certain technologies will be able to use them politically in ways that those who don't won't. And so watching these technologies, if you wanted to really know about the future of political technologies, for me, that is very much tied up not in large scale cloud computing and all the rest of it. I think it is very closely tied to the kinds of things that you are able to carry and wear with you every day. So if we want to find out what the future of politics looks like, we should be looking at who the groundbreaking people are, who the people are at the edge of wearing wearable technologies, because they'll give us a bit of a hint about that. I think if we wanted to look at just one of these technologies, it would be body cams. So right now, body cams are generally they're becoming required for police for social reasons, because people don't trust police to report what they're actually doing, and the camera tends, at least for now, to lie a little bit less than that. But there's every indication that those cameras will become cheaper and cheaper. And then I suspect that you're going to be required to wear them for certain jobs, for customer relationship jobs, for other kinds of jobs. First, for things like doctors, nurses, first responders, things like that. Then for people who empower beyond the police, anyone who carries a weapon for their work, like security guards and that sort of thing, will likely be required to have a body cam. And then the cost of these things will drop so much that it will be expected that everybody had body cams. For a while, surveillance cameras were the exclusive purview of stores, right? Of places of high security. But now because the cost has dropped, that has been made more available for homes. So I think the same thing will happen with body cams, that I would be surprised if I were not wearing a body cam every day in 10 years. I think that's probably going to become the norm rather than the exception. But this is just one example. It is an example with deep social potential and potential harm and potential advantage. But it's just one example. I think if you go through the various functions that wearable technologies have had in the past and kind of try to forecast them going forward, you'll see that there are some really interesting potential changes out about what it means to be political, what it means to be social, and ultimately what it means to be a human.